This bill would remove the following statutes: trap or targeted regulations of abortion providers, removing language classifying facilities that perform 5 or more first trimester abortions per month as hospitals. It would repeal Virginia's informed consent mandatory ultrasound and 24-hour delay. It would repeal the requirement that second trimester abortions be performed in a hospital licensed by the State Department of Health. It would repeal the requirement for 2 additional physicians in cases of third trimester abortions.
Delegate Tran.
Yes, sir.
How late in a pregnancy would your bill apply if a physician was simply willing to certify that the continuation of the pregnancy would impair the mental health of the woman? How late are we talking about?
Well, so the way the suggestion that we've made in the bill is to say it's in the third trimester and at the, with the certification of the physician. So
how late in the third trimester would you be able to do that?
It's very unfortunate that our physicians, witnesses, were not able to attend today to speak specifically.
No, I'm talking about your bill. How late in the third trimester could a physician perform an abortion if he indicated it would impair the mental health of the woman?
Or physical health.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm talking about the mental health.
So, through the third trimester. The third trimester goes all the way up to 40 weeks.
Okay. But to the end of the third trimester.
Yep. I don't think we have a limit in the bill.
So, where it's obvious that a woman is about to give birth, she has physical signs that she is about to give a birth, would that still be a point at which she could request an abortion if she was so certified? She's dilating.
Mr. Chairman, that would be a decision that the doctor, the physician, and the woman would make.
I understand that. I'm asking
point.
if your bill allows that.
My bill would allow that, yes.
I certainly could have said a week from her due date, and that would have been the same answer, correct?
That it's allowed in the bill, yes.
Yes. And in addition to what you just represented, you do acknowledge that you substantially changed the standard by removing a couple of words here, correct? Substantially and irremediably. I'm sorry, line 80. Line 80.
I'm sorry. Can you just tell me? I think I'm in the right part that you're looking at as well.
Line 80.
Line 80. You are changing the standard under which the judgment call is made.
I'm aware.
Okay, third trimester bill.
For an abortion at any point in the third trimester. You're changing the standard.
I'm changing the standard, yes.
Okay, all right. What type of mental health conditions would you anticipate would be utilized by physicians under these circumstances to determine that a child that is otherwise viable is worthy of an abortion?
Again, I'm not a physician, so I can't make those calls as to when a physician would determine that a woman's mental health where they would be able to certify an abortion at that point.
But the physician wouldn't have to have any specialized training in mental health to make that determination under your bill, right?
Under this bill, no.
Okay. All right, thank you. Delegate Tran, what are some of the conditions that a woman could be experiencing in a third trimester, late-term pregnancy for which abortion and not delivery would be the optimal result to protect either her life or health or that of the child, if that's even an interest? But what would be is there any commonly accepted medical decision to terminate the pregnancy in the late term rather than deliver the child if the mother's health or life is actually in danger?
Mr. Chairman, I am aware that there are certain medical conditions where that might be an option for the mother, and I would actually turn over to Galena from NARAL to see if she has those specific medical examples.
Okay.
Thank you.
So,
Hi, I'm really short.
That's okay. I don't have a lot of specific examples because I'm not a physician. I'm an attorney. So, and we unfortunately do not have the physicians could not be here today because they are seeing patients at the moment. I know that there are certain central nervous system anomalies that cannot be determined until later stages in the pregnancy. I also know that certain anomalies like the absence of certain organs.
Okay,
and,
so you're talking about the child. Now, let me just leave that out of the equation then.
Sure.
In terms of the health or life of the mother, what conditions are there that can't be resolved by delivering the child rather than undergoing an abortion?
Again, I am not a physician. What I can point to a case that happened in Ireland. That's the first one that comes to my mind. That I'm happy to find for you and send you the article about. I can definitely send you that article, and if you'll give me some time, I can ask our physicians to provide you with a list of maladies that can lead to a woman having to have an abortion at the late stage of pregnancy. I do know that those cases exist.
But you don't know what they are.
Like I said, not a physician. I do not have those specifics about the woman. I have some specifics about the fetus. I do not have the specifics
Okay.
about the woman.
All right. And again, since you yielded, you don't have any, I'm talking to you now,
Yes.
Delegate, you don't have any specifics on that, obviously.
No, I don't. I'm
Okay.
not a physician either.
Okay, well, we're talking about a lot of physician stuff here, and nobody appears to know the answer, and the doctors aren't here. So, it would have been helpful maybe to have those questions answered.
No exception. There was a very contentious committee hearing yesterday when Fairfax County Delegate Kathy Tran made her case for lifting restrictions on third trimester abortions as well as other restrictions now in place. And she was pressed by a Republican delegate about whether her bill would permit an abortion even as a woman is essentially dilating, ready to give birth. And she answered that it would permit an abortion at that stage of labor. Do you support her measure and explain her answer?
Yeah, and I wasn't there, Julie, and I certainly can't speak for Delegate Tran, but I will tell you first thing I would say is this is why decisions such as this should be made by providers, physicians, and the mothers and fathers that are involved. There are, when we talk about third trimester abortions, these are done with the consent of obviously the mother, with the consent of the physicians, more than one physician, by the way. And it's done in cases where there may be severe deformities, there may be a fetus that's non-viable. So in this particular example, if a mother is in labor, I can tell you exactly what would happen. The infant would be delivered. The infant would be kept comfortable. The infant would be resuscitated if that's what the mother and the family desired. And then a discussion would ensue between the physicians and the mother. So I think this was really blown out of proportion. But again, we want the government not to be involved in these types of decisions. We want the decision to be made by the mothers and their providers. And this is why, Julie, that legislators, most of whom are men, by the way, shouldn't be telling a woman what she should and shouldn't be doing with her body.
And do you think multiple physicians should have to weigh in as is currently required? She's trying to lift that requirement.
Well, I think it's always good to get a second opinion and for at least two providers to be involved in that decision, because these decisions shouldn't be taken lightly. And so, I would certainly support more than one provider.
All right.
You're recognized for a question, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So it's just really hard for me to even ask you this question because I'm almost in disbelief. If a baby is born on a table as a result of a botched abortion, what would Planned Parenthood want to have happen to that child that's struggling for life?
You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We believe that any decision that's made should be left up to the woman, her family, and the physician.
Okay. Chair Davis, and then we'll come back to you, Rep. Oliva.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I believe you were in the committee room whenever I asked Representative Pigman the question about what happens in a situation where a baby is alive, breathing on a table, moving, what do your physicians do at that point?
You're recognized.
I do not have that information. I am not a physician. I'm not an abortion provider. So I do not have that information.
Follow up. Go ahead, sir.
I understand that you're not a physician, but you do represent physicians who do perform this activity. And can you tell me what happens when a baby is alive on the table at that point? What do they do with the baby that is struggling to live?
You're recognized.
I don't know, and as it's been referenced earlier, you know, we don't know even how prevalent this situation is.
I don't know how else I can get an answer, Mr. Chairman.
All right, well, we'll go to Representative Oliva for his question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Along the same lines, you stated that that a baby born on a table as a result of a botched abortion, that decision should be left to the doctor and the family. Is that what you're saying?
It should. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That decision should be between the patient and the healthcare provider.
Follow up. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that at that point, the patient would be the child struggling on a table. Wouldn't you agree?
You're recognized.
That's a very good question. I really don't know how to answer that. I think, you know, I would be glad to have some more, you know, conversations with you about this.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Cleland for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If the law doesn't speak to a physician's obligation in an abortion clinic setting, then what conflict do you have here? You mentioned in your testimony that the law already speaks to that, but if it doesn't in the abortion clinic setting, what issue do you have with that being codified in this bill?
You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Okay, I'm not sure I understand your question.
You can rephrase it.
Thank you. From what I gathered from your testimony, physicians have an obligation already under the law to provide advanced life support to a child born alive. But if the law doesn't speak to that in an abortion clinic setting, and I think the bill sponsor, who's a physician, testified that it doesn't, then what issue would you have with that being in the current bill?
You're recognized.
Okay, are we talking about my reference to the federal law?
I suppose so, yeah.
Okay, because I just want to be clear. We support the neutrality clause that was in the Federal Born Alive Infants Protection Act of 2012, which has been addressed.
Okay. Follow up, Mr. Chair. Does that address the obligation of a doctor in an abortion clinic setting to provide advanced life support to a child who was born alive in an abortion?
No, the neutrality clause addresses the situation where this particular language can't be extrapolated out through other, statutes dealing with abortion. It just deals with this particular area.
Okay.
So,
sorry. Notwithstanding that, does Planned Parenthood have an objection to a doctor being obligated to provide advanced life support in an abortion clinic setting to a child born alive? I mean, I guess you do, or you wouldn't be here, right?
You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just pause and say where our opposition remains. Okay, then maybe that can answer some questions. We have serious concerns about the surrender wording in this. The second piece is, as you all discussed earlier, was the transport to the hospital. We would like to be in a position to remove our opposition, and again, Representative Pigman has been great to work with. He's been very friendly to us in terms of some language that we were trying to seek. So I do want to give him kudos for that.
One final follow-up, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the indulgence. What objection could you possibly have to obligate a doctor to transport a child born alive to a hospital, where it seems to me they would be most likely to be able to survive?
You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What about this, and I'm just speaking out here, what about the situations where it's in a rural healthcare setting, the hospital is 45 minutes, an hour away, that's the closest trauma center, emergency room. There's just some logistical issues involved that we've got some concerns about.
Okay, thank you very much, and we will proceed.
Thank you.
I think we're done with questions of members here. Thank you, ma'am.
This is not a pro-life, pro-choice issue. To me, this is a practical problem. I believe that people put in that situation ought not to have Congress tell them that they're never going to be able to have children again. Everybody has to ask themselves what is fundamentally fair here. I think a lot of people thought, but I think you ought to refer to people who are not so caught up. You know, Hillary and I we only had one child. And I just cannot look at a woman who's in a situation where the baby she is bearing, against all her wishes and prayers, is going to die anyway, and tell her that I am signing a law which will prevent her from ever having another child. I'm not going to do it.
But I have to confess, Madam President, that I am somewhat bewildered that we're having this debate at this time in our nation's history. Obviously, the Republican leadership here in the Senate, along with the House and the White House, have made a choice. Of all the grave challenges facing our nation, at this moment in history, they want to work together to criminalize a private medical decision made by women and their physicians. With so much at stake, when our economic security, national security, and domestic security are at stake, I believe that is an unusual and, in my view, a misguided choice. Emotions run high with this issue, and I deeply appreciate my good friend from Nevada in the way that he acknowledged that we have very serious differences, but this is not a place, nor is this a subject, where we should be using language as a weapon to divide Americans. So I'm very concerned about some of the words I've heard used on this floor over the last several days. Execution, murder, those are very inflammatory words that don't do justice to this great chamber, nor to the seriousness of this debate. And I'm also concerned about some of the visual aids that have been used by some of my colleagues. They are as deceptive as they are heartbreaking. Because what do they show? They show a perfectly formed fetus. And that is misleading. Because if we're really going to have this debate, then we should have a chart that demonstrates the tragic abnormalities that confront women forced with this excruciatingly difficult decision. Where are the swollen heads? Where are the brainless heads? Where are the hearts and the lungs growing outside the body?
Does the senator know that most recent Gallup polls, and in fact polls consistently have showed that this banning of this procedure is supported from anywhere from 65 to 75% of the American public? What is your definition of extreme?
Well, I would respond to the senator from Pennsylvania that I think it's extreme when the government prescribes medical procedures that may, despite there not being ones that most of us would ever hope to have to experience for any loved one, might be necessary in certain specific events that were medically determined.
So you would suggest that something that is supported by you're going to maintain your comment that something that is supported by 70% of the American public is extreme?
Well, you know, I think that the senator from Pennsylvania is posing a false syllogism. Clearly, if people are told in a poll about the kinds of procedures that might be medically necessary out of context, I can certainly understand why the reaction might be, you know, that's not something that, you know, we want to talk about, that's not something we want to think about. But what I do think is extreme is making a decision in this body to outlaw a medical procedure that may or may not be required.
So you don't think the American public understands this issue well enough to be able to form a judgment, I think is what you're saying, even though we have been debating this issue and it's been very much in the literature across America for 7 years. There's been referendums in states. There's been wide debate on this. You just don't think the American public understands it. I would beg to differ with you on that, and I think I could stipulate that something that has support of 70% of the American public is by definition not extreme. But if you don't agree with that, that's certainly your position. I respect that. The other thing you said was that the chart that I was using, if you could put that chart up, is deceptive. Now, I'm very curious as how you came to that conclusion. You said it's deceptive because it shows a perfectly formed baby. Now, is the senator aware of Ron Fitzsimmons, who runs the Association of Abortion Clinics, who has said that when the argument was made by many of the people that Senator Boxer and Senator Murray and yourself have referred to came forward and talked about this being medically necessary or necessary because of complications late in pregnancy, that Ron Fitzsimmons says he lied through his teeth when he gave that argument? This is his term. He said, I lied through my teeth that this was the case. He said, it's a dirty little secret. We all know, this is his terms, it's a dirty little secret. We all know that late-term abortions are performed, the vast majority, his term, vast majority of late-term abortions are performed on healthy mothers with healthy babies. So do you believe it's deceptive to put before the American public the typical case of where a partial birth abortion performed, or would it be more deceptive? Would it be more deceptive to try to convince the American public that this is done for medical reasons or on sick babies in the majority of cases when it's not true? Which would you say is more deceptive?
Well, you know, to the senator's point, I am not arguing against any public education efforts, any proselytizing, any means whatsoever to persuade people about what choice they should make. I don't, in fact, think that we've done enough to educate the American public about what's really at stake in this debate over choice. But for the senator to imply that there are never instances of abnormalities and problems like the ones represented by the women in my office yesterday that would be outlawed by your legislation, I believe, is deceptive. Now, we could solve this, as we have now for 20, 30 years, by saying that this is a debate that does not belong in the United States Senate. It belongs in the hearts, the minds, the conscience, and the medical offices of America, not the United States Senate.
Senator from Pennsylvania has the floor.
I would challenge you to find any place in the record over the last 7 years where I said that that was never the case. I have never said that there are not difficult cases. What I have said repeatedly, and because I wanted to be truthful with respect to the factual situations that we are presented with on the issue of late-term abortions and the instances in which partial birth abortions are used. I refer to the senator to the state of Kansas, where they have to report in the state of Kansas the reason for a partial birth abortion. 182 were done, I think, last year or the year before, and of those 182, none, zero, were done because of a problem with the child or a problem, the physical problem with the mother. They were all classified as, quote, mental health. And so I would just suggest to you that the abortion industry themselves says that this is the typical procedure on the typical baby. And there may be and there are a small number of cases that are late term where you find out the child within the womb has a fetal abnormality and may not live. And I would just suggest, and you use the terms, where is the brainless head? Where are the lungs outside the body? And I would just say, I'll be happy to put a child with a disability But I frankly don't see the difference in my mind, and I'm not too sure the public does, with respect to that's any less of a child. It still is a child, is it not? Maybe it's a child that's not going to live long.
Would the senator from Pennsylvania yield? Would the senator from Pennsylvania yield for a question?
I'll be happy to in one moment. Do we consider a child that may not live long or may have an abnormality to be less of a child? Is this less of a human being because it's not perfect? Have we reached the point in our society where because perfection now is so required of us that those who are not perfect don't even deserve the chance, the opportunity to live forever long, that they are ticketed to live in this country? Is that what we're saying, that we need these kinds of infanticide to weed out those that are not going to survive or those who are not perfect, that somehow or another we have to have a method available that we only allow perfect children to be born? If that's the argument, I'm willing to stand here and have that debate.
Barack Obama's abortion voting record continues to come under fire. Now it centers around his controversial decision not to vote for the Born Alive Infant Protection Act when he was a state senator in Illinois. The act provided legal rights to babies that survived botched late-term abortions. Now, I sat down for an exclusive interview with nurse Jill Stanek, and she was a nurse whose personal experience led her to testify in support of the bill that Obama opposed in 2003. Explain to our audience, just to set this up, what a late-term labor-induced abortion is, so they understand, because you're a nurse, and I want people to understand fully what it is.
Sure, this is not partial birth abortion. This is called induced labor abortion. And for this procedure, the physician inserts a medication into the mom's birth canal that dilates the cervix. And the intent is for the baby to be delivered prematurely. They're fully formed but very small. So when the cervix opens, essentially the baby falls out of the uterus, and it is anticipated that the baby will die during the birth process or soon afterwards, but sometimes these babies live for a time. Christ Hospital, where I worked, confessed to the Chicago Sun-Times in 2001 that between 10 and 20% of babies at that hospital that were aborted by this method survived.
You tell the story, a heart-wrenching story about a Down syndrome baby that you found that was living, that had been abandoned in the soiled utility room at the hospital, that you ended up cradling and rocking and holding for the 45 minutes that this baby lived. Tell us that story.
One night, a nursing coworker was taking a little baby boy who had been aborted alive at between 21 and 22 weeks because he had Down syndrome to our soiled utility room to die because his parents didn't want to hold him, and she didn't have time to hold him that night. And when she told me what she was doing, I couldn't bear the thought of this suffering child dying alone, and so I did cradle and rock him for the 45 minutes that he lived.
Now, I understand now the hospital is disputing this, even though you say they admit that this had happened.
The hospital has never publicly disputed it before today. I've been publicly testifying under oath for years, and the hospital has never denied it, and the hospital has never sued me for libel, so now I'm not the only one who testified either. Another nurse testified in Washington about her experience, too.
All right, what was Barack Obama? Here you're telling this heart-wrenching story about the little baby that survived this abortion. And again, this is the Born Alive Infant Protection Act. In other words, if it's a botched abortion, the baby doesn't die as, quote, planned, that the baby would then be entitled to, as a person, to get medical care, etc. When you told the story about cradling and rocking this baby for 45 minutes in the soiled utility room, what was Barack Obama's reaction?
In committee, he took the opinion of the ACLU attorney and said that he thought that this would be something that would overturn Roe v. Wade, and he opposed it in committee. And then he took a leadership role opposing this to go on and be the sole senator to speak against this bill on the Senate floor, not once, but 2 years in a row. And he brags on his website now that he strategized with Planned Parenthood to defeat this bill.
Yeah. Now,
Senate Bill 1663, an act concerning abortion. Third reading of the bill.
Senator O'Malley.
Mr. President, again, thank you. This is the third component of the Born Alive package. And what it provides is that a child born under any circumstances would receive all reasonable measures consistent with good medical practice. It also requires a second physician to give an opinion of viability and to deliver such reasonable measures of care as are defined in 1663. Again, I'd be happy to answer any questions there may be.
Is there any discussion? Senator Cullerton.
Would the sponsor yield?
Sponsor indicates he'll yield.
Senator O'Malley, which one of these bills was the Medical Society, did they testify against? Was it all three of them or just this one?
Senator O'Malley.
You know, I really can't speak for them, but I suspect their major issue was with 1661.
Any further discussion? Senator Obama.
Thank you, Mr. President. Will the sponsor yield for a question?
Sponsor indicates he'll yield.
Yeah, just along the same lines, obviously there's an issue that we've debated extensively both in committee and on the floor, so I don't want to belabor it, but I did want to point out, as I understood it during the course of the discussion in committee, one of the things that we were concerned about, or at least I expressed some concern about, was what impact this would have with respect to the relationship between the doctor and the patient and what liabilities the doctor might have in this situation. So can you just describe for me, under this legislation, what's going to be required for a doctor to meet the requirements that you've set forth?
Senator O'Malley.
Senator Obama, first of all, there is established under this legislation that a child born under such circumstances would receive all reasonable measures consistent with good medical practice, and that's as defined, of course, by the, the practice of medicine in the community where this would occur. It also requires, in two instances, that that an attending physician be brought in to assist and advise with respect to the issue of viability, and in particular, where there's a suspicion on behalf of the physician that the child may be viable, that there's a suspicion, so that the attending physician would make that decision as to whether that would be the case. The other one is where the child is actually born alive and then is actually born alive, in which case then the physician would call as soon as practically possible for a second physician to come in and determine the viability.
Senator Obama.
So, and again, I'm not going to prolong this, but I just want to be clear because I think this was the source of the objections of the Medical Society. As I understand it, this puts the burden on the attending physician, who has determined, since they were performing this procedure, that in fact this is a non-viable fetus, that if that fetus or child, however way you want to describe it, is now outside the mother's womb, and the doctor continues to think that it's non-viable, but there's, let's say, movement or some indication that in fact they're not just coming out limp and dead, that in fact they would then have to call a second physician to monitor and check off and make sure that this is not a live child that could be saved. Is that correct?
Senator O'Malley.
In the first instance, obviously the physician that is performing the procedure would make the determination. The second situation is where the child actually is born and is alive, and then there is an assessment, an independent assessment of viability by another physician at the soonest practical date or time.
Senator Obama.
Let me just go to the bill very quickly. Essentially, I think, as this emerged during debate and during committee, the only plausible rationale to my mind for this legislation would be if you had a suspicion that a doctor, the attending physician, who has made an assessment that this is a non-viable fetus, and that, let's say for the purposes of the mother's health, is being, that labor is being induced, that physician, A, is going to make the wrong assessment, and B, if the physician discovered after the labor had been induced that in fact he made an error or she made an error, and in fact that this was not a non-viable fetus but in fact a live child, that physician of his own accord or her own accord would not try to exercise the sort of medical measures and practices that would be involved in saving that child. Now, if you think that there are possibilities that doctors would not do that, then maybe this bill makes sense. But I suspect, and my impression is that the medical society suspects as well, that doctors feel that they would be under that obligation, that they would already be making these determinations, and that essentially adding an additional doctor who then has to be called in an emergency situation to come in and make these assessments is really designed simply to burden the original decision of the woman and the physician to induce labor and perform an abortion. Now, if that's the case, and I know that some of us feel very strongly one way or another on that issue, that's fine, but I think it's important to understand that this issue ultimately is about abortion and not live births, because if these are children who are being born alive, I at least have confidence that a doctor who is in that room is going to make sure that they're looked after. Thanks to all of you at Planned Parenthood for all the work that you are doing for women all across the country and for families all across the country and for men who have enough sense to realize you're helping them all across the country.
I've got two daughters, 9 years old and 6 years old. I'm going to teach them, first of all, about values and morals, but if they make a mistake, I don't want them punished with a baby.
Deal with abortion. At what point does a baby get human rights, in your view?
Well, you know, I think that whether you're looking at it from a theological perspective or a scientific perspective, answering that question with specificity, you know, is above my pay grade.
And Secretary, I want to ask you about some comments that you made over the weekend on Meet the Press regarding abortion. You said, quote, the unborn person doesn't have constitutional rights. And my question is, at what point does someone have constitutional rights? And are you saying that a child on its due date, just hours before delivery, still has no constitutional rights?
Under our law, that is the case, Paula.
If you go with what Hillary is saying, in the 9th month, you can take the baby and rip the baby out of the womb of the mother just prior to the birth of the baby. Now, you can say that that's okay, and Hillary can say that that's okay, but it's not okay with me. Because based on what she's saying and based on where she's going and where she's been, you can take the baby and rip the baby out of the womb in the 9th month. On the final day, and that's not acceptable.
Well, that is not what happens in these cases, and using that kind of scare rhetoric is just terribly unfortunate.
But that when you say right now,
procedure, right now the way the Supreme Court looks, I don't think it looks very good. Okay. If you talk to my litigation and law folks, anything that's going to go to the Supreme Court right now, we are all losers. Kind of rate-limiting step of the procedure is calvarium. Calvarium, the head is basically the biggest part. Most of the other stuff can come out intact.
Right.
It's very rare to have a case that doesn't have enough dilation to evacuate all the other
To bring the body cavity out, intact and all that.
So then you're just kind of cognizant of where you put your grafts. You try to intentionally go above and below the thorax so that, you know, we've been very good at getting hard, long liver, because we know that, so I'm not going to crush that part. I'm going to basically crush below, I'm going to crush above, and I'm going to see if I can get it out intact. And with the calvarium, in general, some people will actually try to change the presentation so that's not a vertex. So it's a vertex presentation. You never have enough dilation at the beginning unless you have real huge amount of dilation to deliver an intact calvarium. So if you do it starting from the breech presentation, there's dilation that happens as the case goes on, and often at the last you can evacuate an intact calvarium. So I mean, there are certainly steps that can be taken.
So they can convert to breech, for example, at the start of the...
Exactly. Under ultrasound guidance, they can just change the presentation. Under ultrasound guidance, they can just change the presentation.
To bring the body cavity out, intact and all that.
So if you do it starting from the breech presentation, there's dilation that happens as the case goes on, and often at the last you can evacuate an intact calvarium. Federal abortion ban is a law, and laws are up to interpretation. So if I say on day one I do not intend to do this, what ultimately happens doesn't matter.
Using ditch.
20 weeks, but we don't have to right now.
Because of...
There's a nationwide shortage of ditch.
Really?
Yeah.
Would be fine. So if we had 18 or 19 weeks, then that we could get those to you.
Okay, and it doesn't have digoxin though.
No,
okay,
it does not.
Yeah.
And we always, and I mean, we've been in the business long enough. I can tell if it's been ditched or not. You know, I just look at it. I go,
oh, really?
Yeah. I mean, it has a smell. It's not right. So
wow.
It's just kind of icky.
Yeah.
But because of what we do and because we use fetal tissue, we don't want to, we want to be as politically correct as we can.
Right,
I know. We don't want a whole lot of people coming in and, slap us because, you're doing this and you're getting all these scientific people here and they're all agreeing, that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
so.
It's kind of counterintuitive, isn't it, right? Like normally, like embryonic stem cell research is like the big controversial, like whatever, and like
And you know what the
compared
really
to
weird thing is? Embryonic, there's still a lot of controversy about that, But then fetal kind of got lost in the mix,
Was it ever controversial? I mean, I'm young, so I don't know.
It was never outlawed. Where during the Bush administration, Bush one, it was no federal funding could go to stem cell research or to embryonic cell research. But fetal tissue was taken out of that. So we continued to send tissue to people like NIH. Even though the government was paying for it, fetal tissue weren't put in that little box of embryonic because it's different.
Her call, my name's, hey Ollie, come over here. I want you to see something kind of cool. This is kind of neat. So I'm over here, and this is the moment I see it, I'm just flabbergasted. This is the most gestated fetus and closest thing to a baby I've seen. And she's like, okay, I want to show you something. So she has one of her instruments, and she just taps the heart, and it starts beating. And I'm sitting here, and I'm looking at this fetus, and its heart is beating. And I don't know what to think.
Is there still circulation in the heart once you isolate it?
So, so there are times when after the procedure is done that the heart actually is still beating.
And did you understand exactly what the digoxin does? That's the injection that they give you. It's one of your forms that you filled out.
And it like goes into my stomach, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That stops the heartbeat.
Of the baby?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. And you're okay with that?
I don't really have another choice, do I?
Well, you don't, but you could probably do it without the digoxin if you wanted to.
How?
Well, it just takes longer.
How do they do it then?
Huh?
How do they do it if they don't use it?
Well, they don't just the digoxin, they'll just suction the baby, and it's possible that there may be movement as they're taking out the fetus.
Like movement after?
Mm-hmm.
And then what happens?
Well, then usually it stops on its own.
Okay. So if they use the
digoxin?
No, what did you say, suction?
Uh-huh.
So if they use the suction, then there's possible movement when it comes out.
Yeah, and sometimes after...
Is it alive or?
Sometimes they are, yeah. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it will come out whole, because they use suction, plus they use instruments, and sometimes the fetuses don't come out, that's not complete.
Okay.
So,
but if it does come out whole,
mm-hmm.
I mean, will they resuscitate it? Like, will I have to take care of it?
Mm-mm.
Okay.
No, but the digoxin is probably the best thing for it. That way there's no suffering. Okay?
Okay.
I need your signature and date on that line, and then we'll get you going.
If that does happen, like if they do it, if I were to choose to do it that way, like, you would just let it go, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you would just let it die on its own if it
Mm-hmm.
was whole and
Mm-hmm.
breathing. Yes?
You do not resuscitate.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just let it die on its own and...
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And the chances of it coming out with a heartbeat are kind of slim because, like I said, it's a procedure where they use instruments and suction, and it's most of the time they don't come out whole.
Okay.
But
if it does, then I don't have to worry about getting in trouble or taking a baby home.
Oh, no. Okay.
Get the pregnancy out intact, but it doesn't always happen that way. I cut the umbilical cord first, wait for the baby to expire, and then we do it that way. Okay. So hopefully the fetus will expire first, and then we do the pregnancy termination that way.
Okay. And then how big is the baby?
Your pregnancy at this point is about 24, 25 weeks.
Okay.
So
it's pretty, like, is it like,
it's about the size of your hand.
So you say you take it out intact?
We tried, yeah, that's the whole reason why we do the dilation today and tomorrow.
Does it ever, like, move or anything when it comes out? Or?
That's why I try and sever the umbilical cord first, and we wait for that to stop pulsing. And that's why the fetus is expired first, so it doesn't.
Okay, so has it ever survived?
After
when it comes out?
Not here, no.
Okay.
No, it could. I mean, if some people go into labor, prior to us, when you do this, what we do is we try and help the cervix dilate, and some people will go into labor before we do the procedure.
Okay.
And that can happen.
Okay.
It's unusual.
And then what do you...
Usually at this point in your pregnancy, it's too early to survive usually.
Okay.
It will expire shortly after birth.
But if it did, like what would happen? Like, would I have to take it home or like be responsible for?
I mean, technically, legally we would be obligated to help it, to survive, but it probably wouldn't. It's all in how vigorously you do things to help a fetus survive at this point. When you have a pregnancy that's 23, 24 weeks, if you're, extra, if you do everything possible to help it survive, there's maybe a 20 to 30% chance that it would survive. If you don't do anything, then the chances are much, much less.
I'm just like so scared of like having to be stuck with the responsibility. Like, would you make sure that it like it doesn't
there's things you do. Obviously, you're here for a certain procedure, and if your pregnancy were, let's say, you went into labor, the membrane's ruptured, and you delivered before we got to the termination part of the procedure here, then we would do things. We would not help it. Let's say we wouldn't intubate.
Okay.
Okay.
So you would make sure.
Yeah, we wouldn't do any extra. It's like it would be a person that would be a terminal person in the hospital. Let's say that had cancer. You wouldn't do any extra procedures to help that person survive. They had like do not resuscitate orders.
Okay.
We would do the same things here.
Okay.
Whereas if you were in a hospital in Virginia, let's say, and you went into labor and you went to the hospital and then they saw you deliver, they would do everything possible to help that fetus survive.
Okay, but you won't.
We wouldn't.
Okay.
And that's happened before, to tell you the truth.
Really?
Yeah, where, we've had patients that, on the second day of the laminaria, they got some contractions and they panicked and they were in Virginia at the hospital and they went to the hospital because they had some pain instead of calling me, and they just went to the hospital and the hospital helped them to deliver, which was the stupidest thing they could have done.
Oh my God.
Which was, and they did everything they shouldn't have done, which was help them to deliver.
That's the other thing, because, DIG kind of rules out.
It ruins the integrity of the study.
I mean, it kills the stem cells.
I mean, so the thing is, it's really, and then that really comes issue because in Arizona, if the fetus comes out with any signs of life, we're supposed to transport it.
At any gestational age?
Any gestational age.
Is there any standard procedure for verifying signs of life?
Well, the thing is,
that doesn't go in a chart.
I mean, the key is you need to pay attention to who's in the room, right? The key is you need to pay attention to who's in the room, right? And because the thing is, the law states you're not supposed to do any maneuvers after the fact to try to cause demise. So it's really tricky.
It sounds like it's really hard to navigate that bad.
Yeah, it's really tricky. So we do, most of the time we do DIG and it usually works. And then we don't have to worry about that because Arizona state law says if there are signs of life, then we're supposed to transfer. It's a mess.
Yeah.
It's been years since I've talked about compensation, so let me just figure out what others are getting at. If this is in the ballpark, then that's fine. If it's still low, then we can talk about it. You would. I want a Lamborghini. I want a Lamborghini.
Don't we all, right?
Yeah, exactly.
An elementary skill for an OB-GYN is amniocentesis, and that's when you introduce a needle because you need to do some sampling into the uterus. Typically it's done around 14, 16 weeks gestational age, very early, before pro-choice people tell us that they can feel pain. But if the baby runs into the needle, he withdraws exactly as we would expect someone who feels pain to withdraw. Additional studies have shown they have increased adrenaline, increased heart rate. They show all of the same signs that we expect from someone who feels pain. As a society, we want to protect lab rats from feeling pain. We've got more legislation to protect the lab rats than we do the children that we're electively terminating.